As a racing game fan, there are so many different games to choose from. Some very good, some frankly very bad. But what about those games that are just alright? Those average games with some fairly good ideas but not so great execution. And that's what I wanted to take a look back on today. Some average racing games that had some good ideas. We've got cartoony kart racers to mission-based action driving games, all the way to trying to cram racing simulators onto a DS. So without further ado, let's begin.
In the year 2000, Electronic Arts released a game that should have been an instant classic. A game built on one of the most iconic franchises in cinematic history. A game that promised gadgets, exotic missions, high-speed chases, and all the sleek car fantasy that comes with the James Bond name. That game was 007 Racing for the original PlayStation. But instead of giving players a fantasy of suave espionage behind the wheel, 007 Racing became infamous for something else entirely. A brilliant concept trapped inside a painfully clunky, uneven and sometimes downright baffling execution with, let's face it, a misleading title. So we're going to ask the question, how did a James Bond game about cars manage to miss the mark so dramatically while still remaining strangely fascinating? So to get a better grasp of 007 Racing, we have to understand where the Bond franchise and the game industry were around the turn of the millennium. It was the year 2000, with the PlayStation 2 was on the horizon, and the Nintendo 64 had just given us the legendary GoldenEye. And the somewhat less legendary The World Is Not Enough. Bond games were hot, or at least publishers believed they could be. Electronic Arts held the license and wanted to expand Bond beyond the typical first-person shooter formula, and their idea? A standalone vehicle-focused Bond game where you wouldn't just occasionally drive a gadget-laden car, like in other Bond titles, you would drive them everywhere, all the time, and complete missions built around them. And to be fair to EA, which is not a sentence I say very often, it was actually a genius idea. Bond is practically synonymous with cool cars. The Aston Martin DB5 with its iconic machine guns, the Lotus Esprit submarine. There's so many good cars you can choose from these films. A car-centric Bond game kind of felt like a natural evolution of the series. But here's where the irony kicks in a little. 007 Racing ended up feeling like a modernized version of Spy Hunter. Except Spy Hunter was itself originally inspired by James Bond. So the Bond franchise circled around and accidentally ended up competing with its own imitator. So whilst 007 Racing may have been published by EA, the game was actually developed by Eutechnyx. Eutechnyx are a developer we've looked at on this channel a couple of times before, most notably with their entry of Ford vs Chevy, but also with Max Power Racing, also known as C3 Racing Car Constructors Championship, but also Total Driving for the PS1 as well. They've developed a lot of racing games over the years, all the way up to 2015 with NASCAR 15. And whilst they don't have a perfect track record, some of their games are genuinely not that bad. Anyway, I'm not sure if EA or Eutechnyx were the company behind the naming of the game, but whichever one of them named it 007 Racing is stupid. There's like no racing in this game. There's a couple of missions where you race against the clock, but other than that, it's all car combat and cool explosive set pieces. There's like no racing in this racing game. Now before we go any further, if you're a fan of racing games, PS1 games, or just retro games in general, then why not hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications to stay up to date with the worst racing game series. And whilst you're at it, if you're a big fan of this channel and you want to support it further, then please check out my Patreon using the link in the description below. It would be greatly appreciated. Over on my Patreon, you can get access to cool goodies such as early access to videos and your name in the credits of every upload. Anyway, that's enough selling the channel to you. Let's talk about the gameplay of 007 Racing. So the gameplay is where 007 both shines and stumbles in dramatic fashion. On paper, the game sounds pretty good. You get to drive a whole fleet of Bond vehicles, from the DB5, a couple of BMWs, and a handful of other franchise favourites.
Each car is packed with gadgets from Q Branch. We're talking machine guns, missiles, oil slicks, smoke screens, standard Bond stuff. And even more gimmicky ones like a high-tech laser designed for slicing tires off of trucks. It sounds pretty cool. This is the kind of thing that Bond fans would dream of, and at its core, the actual driving in 007 Racing isn't bad. Acceleration, braking, and even the e-brake drift mechanic all feel surprisingly solid once you get used to it. The cars make convincing engine sounds. The sense of speed, at least occasionally when you have to get up to speed, is actually pretty good. But then, unfortunately, the rest of the game kicks in. So let's talk mission structure. 007 Racing uses an objective-driven mission format. Each level gives you a set of goals: protect a vehicle, destroy a convoy, disarm mines, or destroy computers, so on and so forth. And this could have been amazing, but the missions have a problem. Well, several problems, to be honest. The objectives are often somewhat confusing. Some levels feel like they were designed first and explained later, if explained at all. Take Airstrike, for example. You're supposed to safely detonate a series of mines, but the game barely communicates what you're actually meant to do. Even when you perform the objective correctly, the game will still knock you for damage. It's trial and error in the purest, but also the most frustrating sense. On top of this, in my opinion, the levels are a bit uneven. Some missions are super fun and a blast to play. Take the Escape level, a fast-paced jungle chase where you race against an assassin through Mexico. It feels like pure spy hunter adrenaline and stands out as one of the few levels where the sense of speed and danger truly lands, and the racing title actually kind of makes sense. But then, you have levels like Ambush and others that feel awkwardly balanced or oddly paced. Sometimes the enemies spawn in frustrating patterns, sometimes the scoring system punishes you after you finish the level, telling you that you met all objectives but didn't hit the minimum score. That's like beating a boss in a game and then being told you didn't win hard enough. Speaking of the Ambush level, some of it just doesn't really make sense. You start the level, get ambushed by some cars, you can destroy them however you want: machine guns, bombs, missiles, any way that you can access in the level, and then you move on to the next segment and get jumped by some guys and also a couple of forklift drivers. Now theoretically, some tiny forklift trucks should just be able to be defeated by machine guns. You could kill the driver inside, but no, you can't. They have to be shot at from a certain angle, they're invincible to missiles, and all they can really be destroyed by is if you trick them into driving into some bombs or shoot them in one very specific place. It doesn't really make that much sense. The game does also have some collision detection issues, and I can't overstate how much the collision detection does hurt the gameplay. Enemies can clip through your car, bullets will pass through targets and do nothing, especially to the human targets because they're quite small. Pedestrians vanish when you hit them, like they were beamed up in Star Trek, and it just makes combat feel slippery and unreliable. And when they've built this game around the point of combat, that's really not good. The other issue I have with the game design is the clunky level construction. Buildings, props, and environmental obstacles often feel like they were placed really without considering how the player needs to navigate the level. Some levels feel wide open and quite empty, and others, again, like the Ambush level, are quite cramped and honestly hard to maneuver. Now let's talk about the graphics of this game. By the year 2000, the PlayStation had masterpieces like Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy, Gran Turismo 2, Pro Skater 2, and Spyro 3. Developers had really pushed the PS1 to its absolute limits, which makes 007 Racing's visuals somewhat confusing. The game looks like it time traveled from the early lifespan of the PlayStation. The game has a very grainy resolution as well as some murky textures and some quite bad pop-in. The best way to describe it, it's like a prototype that forgot to evolve. Collision effects look wrong, the explosions look kinda cheap, and it's not just the world, the characters look tiny and indistinct. Bond's model might as well be a Lego figure wearing a tuxedo made of pixels. Even the HUD looks like it needed more polish. It's certainly not unplayable by any sense, but it definitely looks rough, especially for a game released after so many visually refined PS1 titles. And it's not like this had to have a small budget. 007's a massive name and EA is a big corporation.
Whilst we're on the design side of things, let's talk about the sound design as well, because some of it is really good and some of it is really not so good. So the voice acting. Q is voiced by John Cleese, and as always, he's absolutely fantastic.
Don't even think about using the car as a battering ram, 007. Pick up some ammunition, for heaven's sake.
M sounds solid. Other actors honestly hold their own, but Bond is kinda uncharismatic. There's no Pierce Brosnan voice here, so it really shows. Now in terms of the music, I was a little worried when I opened the game for the first time. The opening cutscene has a bunch of clips from different Bond movies, but instead of the Bond music playing over it, it's just some crappy nightclub music, and I was really concerned that this was just going to be the tone for the rest of the game.
Bond. James Bond.
Thankfully, when you're in the levels, you do actually get the Bond music playing and mixes of it, and it does sound really good, and it fits the theme really well. Now let's talk the critical response to 007 Racing. The game reviewed very averagely, veering more to the negative side of things. The game currently holds a 51 out of 100 on Metacritic for its critical score, and a generally unfavourable 4.9 out of 10 for its user score. So they're kind of similar, but the user score is just a bit lower. And having read through a couple of the user and critical responses, it appears to be the same. Really cool premise, very poor execution. These reviews would not stop the game going on to sell pretty well, however, as it sold over 500,000 copies estimated, with approximately 300,000 of those sales going from North America, and the other 200,000 here in Europe. These stats are from VG-Charts. Now, another thing that I find very interesting when looking into these games is how much the game is currently valued today, as per price charting. And for the PAL version of 007 Racing, which is the version I would have had, for the still in box price we're looking at about £6.80, which, isn't very much. For just the disc alone, about £4.50, but at least if it's still sealed, you could pick it up for about £30, which I guess is what it would have cost new back in 2000. But you could certainly do far worse when it comes to a 007 game. So as we near the end, we have to ask, what exactly is 007 Racing? At its best, it's a really fun idea. A Bond game where you get to drive iconic gadgets in missions inspired by classic films. A car combat adventure filled with potential. But in practice, the game feels like an experiment that never fully came together. It's uneven, a little clumsy, and awkwardly designed in places. But here's the thing, it's not really a disaster like some of the other games we've seen in this series. It's just a bit disappointing. There are flashes of brilliance, the escape mission is genuinely really fun and thrilling, and some of the gadgets feel straight out of the movies. But looking back today, the game has a strange place in history. On the one hand, it's the only game that tries to deliver a purely vehicle-based Bond experience. That alone makes it unique. On the other hand, EA never revisited the idea. There was never a sequel, no spiritual successor. The concept just kind of vanished. Which is a shame because the game sold pretty well and could have had a sequel where they polished out all the issues with the original. And then we probably would have held that one in higher regard. When you need a pretty hefty truck, well, you get a Ford. When you need a basic racing game with no excitement, well, you can also get a Ford. This game was released in September 2003, years after the PlayStation 2 was already in full swing. A fact that by now should shock nobody, yet somehow still manages to raise my eyebrows a little bit. It's one of those titles that seems to occupy a strange corner of gaming history. It's not quite a cult classic, it's not quite a forgotten disaster. To me, it just kind of seems there, this dusty relic of licensed racing that maybe even collectors barely remember. But today, with controller in hand and curiosity burning, we're diving in to Ford Truck Mania. So let's just begin with the basics. Ford Truck Mania is a racing game developed by Alpine Studios and published by Gotham Games for the original PlayStation. Despite releasing in late 2003, it is unmistakably a PS1 title, both in look and feel.
The box art, the menus, the graphics, everything screams PlayStation hardware, not PS2. Obviously, because that's the console it released on. In the world of licensed automotive games, it sits somewhere between mildly interesting and why does this exist? You're not picking from hundreds of cars, wrestling with deep tuning options, or even battling for pole position in beautifully rendered arenas. Instead, you're here for one thing: Ford trucks. Real ones, in racing form. The premise is very simple. You pilot tough Ford trucks across rough terrain, mud, mountains, desert roads, snow, whatever, and leave sedans in the dust, and yes, that is pretty much the entire game. So what modes does Ford Truck Mania actually have? At its core, the game is divided into 3 classes of competition: amateur, semi-pro, and professional. That's the career mode. Each of these classes unlocks tougher races and more challenging tracks. Heck, that's pretty standard for racing games, but for this title, that's where the structure pretty much ends. And to be honest, those difficulties are just a bunch of bullshit anyway, because it's just the AI getting more broken as the difficulties go on and harder for you to catch up to. That's basically all it is. Yes, the tracks are a bit more challenging, but what difference does it make when the AI can do it 100 times better than you can, because they're just programmed to do so? Anyway, the other major component, and one of the only elements that really sets this game apart, is the track builder. Now, to some players, that term might evoke visions of complex editors like what you'd see in Trackmania, or even older PC classics like, I don't know, SimCity, but in Ford Truck Mania, let's just say it's a little bit more humble. The track builder is modular, grid-based, simple, and very basic, but it still gives you the freedom to create your own racing courses, choose your terrain modules, piece them together on a grid, and boom, you've got your own track to race on. It feels like a toy from another era. It was like someone handed me a box of Legos and went, okay, make something fast. And honestly, it was kind of fun. Now let's talk trucks. Ford Truck Mania lets you select 8 standard Ford trucks and 4 modified trucks. That's a total, for those of you not good at math, of 12 drivable vehicles, which is not that bad for a PS1 game. Before each race, you also get to tweak a handful of settings, such as steering, transmission, tyres, suspension, and even the colour of your truck. For a simple title like this, that's impressively comprehensive. Sure, yeah, there's no full vehicle simulation here, but for the era and platform, especially one that was comfortably on its way to extinction, shows that the developers at least try to give players something good. Now let's get honest here, Ford Truck Mania does look like a late-era PlayStation title. The graphics are rough around the edges with blocky trucks and simple textures, but they hold their own in a weirdly endearing way. The terrain, muddy plains, desert stretches and rolling hills, feels just detailed enough that you can tell what's going on, and I'll give credit where it's due, you always know where the track is, which matters more than you might expect. The separation between the track and background elements is clear, and the trucks themselves have enough visual personality that you don't forget what you're controlling, even when the frame rate starts wobbling about a little bit. The audio, meanwhile, is a bit of a mixed bag. On the positive side, the game leans hard into a guitar-driven hard rock soundtrack. It's loud, it screams "I'm manly and I drive trucks," and it gives every race just a little extra spirit. The kind that would make me pump my fist when I cross the finish line. On the less positive side, some of the sound effects like engine revs and tyres on dirt are functional but not really memorable or that engaging. They're fine, but they don't elevate the experience. But again, in a game like this, the visuals and audio aren't meant to wow you so much as keep you engaged. And for what it's worth, for the most part, it does do that. Especially the music. So here's where rubber meets the road. Ford Truck Mania has tracks, and it has your own tracks, but the raw variety is, well, fairly limited. Your career mode or main progression features a set number of predefined tracks, 10 if you count the unlockables. Fine for a PS1 game, many titles from that era barely scrape half of that. But here's the catch. These tracks, well, they don't really have that much going on. They're mostly turns, hills, and a few patches of mud. There are no major hazards, no obstacles, not really any intentional jumps, and barely any surprises. Just you, your truck, and a fairly generic trail ahead. Even the unlocked tracks, which you'd hope would ramp up in creativity, feel like more of the same. They're longer, yes, but they're not really any more interesting. That's where the track builder becomes almost the best part of the game. Sure, yeah, it's simple, square by square track pieces, but it's yours. You can make something more exciting than what the game's canned courses can offer. And after a few races, that freedom will start to feel like a breath of fresh air. How about the controls? Well, the controls in Ford Truck Mania are, well, they're functional. They're predictable, they're straightforward. They won't win awards, but they won't make you want to throw the controller either. Standard controls with X to accelerate, square to brake, and circle to power slide. Or, in theory, power slide. You can turn with the D-pad, or the analog stick, and that's pretty much it. The trucks behave like trucks. They're heavy, they take a moment to wind up speed, and they skid through corners in a way that feels just tangible enough to make sense. Is it deep? No. Does it have any nuance? Not really. Does it feel like you're driving something with weight? Yes, at the very least. For a PlayStation title built around big trucks barreling across dirt and sand, that's pretty much exactly what you want. Here's the weird thing about Ford Truck Mania. Objectively, it shouldn't be good, it shouldn't be exciting, and by the strictest standards of racing games, excellent or otherwise, it's not, really. But there's a vibe here that kinda works. It's the soundtrack, the heaviness of the trucks. It's the simple joy of barreling down a track that you built yourself. It gave me this kind of goofy, borderline nostalgic thrill when I picked this rugged Ford, tweaked some settings, and just went, F it, let's go. The experience is basic, but it's kinda honest. It's not trying to be Gran Turismo, it's certainly not trying to be something like Crash Team Racing. It's just trying to let you race trucks around dirt roads and have a good time doing it. And sometimes, every now and then, that can be enough. That might be all you need. Now, in terms of the critical response to Ford Truck Mania, I genuinely couldn't really find anything to tell you what critics thought of the game at the time. There's like no information about it whatsoever. I managed to find one review that was retroactively published in 2020, giving it a 6 out of 10, so thanks nerdbacon.com for giving me something to go off. As well as basically having no critical response, there were also no sales figures for the game, which would suggest it sold very poorly. Which wouldn't surprise me because this was a 2003 original PlayStation release. If you're curious, I did check how much the game is currently worth here in the UK on pricecharting.com, and apparently for a complete copy, you should be spending about £7 to maybe £8, so not very much if you do want to get a physical copy of this game. So there we have it. Is Ford Truck Mania a great game? No. Is it a fun game? At times, yeah, it can be. Is it worth buying? Well, if you're a collector, a retro fan, or someone who likes quirky off-the-beaten-path titles, then maybe, yeah, for curiosity's sake. This game doesn't shore up the legacy of the PS1, it doesn't define racing, and it certainly doesn't innovate, but it delivers something relatively unique. A simple, rugged, slightly goofy off-road truck racing experience that sticks in your mind longer than you might expect. Do you ever stumble across one of those random budget games at the bottom of a bargain bin? The kind with a shiny logo and a price tag so low it has to be hiding something. Well, this is one of those. Corvette for the PlayStation 2, a fully licensed racing game dedicated to America's favourite sports car. The game promises over 50 years of Corvette history, dozens of tracks, and enough shiny fiberglass to fill an entire dealership. It should be a love letter to the Corvette legacy, instead it's, well, a bit of a mess. So buckle up because we're about to find out why Corvette might just be one of the most random racing games on the PS2. So before we dive into the gameplay, let's just go over a little bit of history about the game. So Corvette was developed by Steel Monkeys and had two different publishers, TDK Mediactive, and this was for the PC and Xbox versions, and Global Star Software for the PlayStation 2 version. So the PC and Xbox port launched in America in December of 2003, before coming to the PlayStation 2 in March 2004, and Europe would finally see this on PS2 in April of 2004. Visual Impact handled a Game Boy Advance port which released in November 2003. So yes, this was released as a budget title, priced at probably just about £10. Corvette was supposed to be a celebration of Chevrolet's iconic sports car lineup. You start out with access to cars from every Corvette generation, from the classic C1 Roadsters of the 50s to the sleeker C5s of the modern era. And surprisingly, there's a lot of content here. You've got two main single-player modes, Career and Arcade, plus a handful of unlockable special modes that keep things interesting. In Career mode, you climb through the Corvette generations with separate championships for each C1, 2, 3, 4, and finally C5. It's divided into amateur and professional tiers, with amateur covering all 5 generations, and pro only offering C2 and C5. Each event limits you to one specific Corvette, so no mixing and matching between eras. It's a neat way to showcase how the cars evolved over time, at least in theory. Then there's also Arcade mode, which is a little bit looser. You can tackle any Corvette class in any order, with a wider selection of cars. Think of it as the career mode without the additional homework. So far, not too bad for a budget racing title. So as you make progress, you'll unlock new tracks for multiplayer, extra paint colours for your cars, and, the real surprise, 5 special modes. These include a time trial, 2 endurance races, a checkpoint challenge, and something called the Custom Vet Challenge, where you race unique cars like the SS Sebring Racer. Not sure if I pronounced that correctly, so shoot me in the comments if I didn't. Oh, and there's one mode where you drive a police car, but you're still being chased by the police. It's bizarre, but in a kind of endearing way. Honestly, for a £10 game, Corvette offers a surprising amount of stuff to do. It's like the developers crammed every half-finished idea they had into the final build, and somehow it works well enough to keep you curious. So if there's one thing Corvette nails, it's definitely variety. You'll race through deserts, forests, city streets, even what looks to be a construction site, and even a military base. It's random, like someone just spun a globe and went, yeah, let's just race there. But it works. The environments aren't spectacular, but they're fine. The car models are actually decent for a budget PS2 game, the reflections look nice, the proportions are right, and each Corvette generation is recognisable. But then you notice the motion blur. Every time you pick up speed, this weird blur effect smears across the screen like someone rubbed Vaseline on the camera lens. It doesn't really make the game feel faster, it just makes it harder to see and looks a bit uglier. It's not that the visuals are terrible, they're just filtered through this digital fog that makes everything look worse than it probably is. Now let's talk about the elephant in the showroom. The handling. Every car in Corvette, from the 1953 C1 to the late model C5, feels like it's driving on ice. The steering is twitchy, the traction is almost non-existent, and the physics don't seem to care what era your car came from. You'd think the early 50s models would feel slow and heavy and perhaps handle worse, and the C5 would handle tighter and more modern, but nope, they all just feel loose. And it's not really a problem of realism, it's a problem of fun. You spend more time wrestling your car back onto the road than actually racing. And I tested this theory with both the analog stick and the D-pad, and both of them were twitchy for steering. Even when you nail a power slide or a corner, the game somehow manages to kill the sense of speed. It's like the developers were allergic to grip. The end result? Races that should be exciting often feel frustratingly floaty. If the driving doesn't wear you down, the audio just might. In my opinion, the soundtrack is just irritating. It's just noise in your ears. The music loops endlessly with riffs that sound like they came from a rejected PlayStation 1 racing game. It's neither exciting nor fitting for a Corvette showcase. And the car audio? Every vehicle sounds pretty much exactly the same. No throaty V8 growls, no classic muscle car rumble, just a generic engine whine that could probably belong to any box. It's disappointing, especially when you consider how much Corvette heritage is built around the sound of the car. Combine that with incredibly long load times, with even the menu transitions taking too long, and it's clear that presentation wasn't the developer's top priority. If you can convince a friend to join you, Corvette does offer local multiplayer. It's, there. You can race on the tracks you've unlocked from career and arcade mode, and that's about it. The camera is locked, the menu system is still clunky, and the sense of speed just isn't there. But again, it's a £10 game. It works, and it can be a good laugh if you're looking for some low stakes competition. The unlock system, new tracks, new colours, new modes, does help to give you a reason to keep playing, even if the core gameplay doesn't evolve. At all. You can tell the devs wanted to make something robust. I'm guessing they just didn't have the time or certainly the budget to make it feel polished. So how did the game hold up in terms of its critical response? Well, it currently holds a 57 out of 100 score on Metacritic, putting it in the mixed or average zone. As well as this, it also has a user score of 5.6, so it's always nice when the user and critical response lines up, and everyone pretty much universally agrees that this is a painfully average video game. Now, weirdly enough, the game would actually go on to sell pretty damn well, with the PS2 version of the game selling over 1 million copies worldwide. These stats are from VG charts. It's important to remember what Corvette was meant to be. This was never a full-priced Gran Turismo competitor, it was a budget title designed to sell for a very cheap price. And for that price, I have to admit, somewhat begrudgingly, that you do get your low price worth of game. Nearly 100 Corvette models spanning half a century, a decent variety of tracks, multiple modes, unlockables, and even multiplayer. The problem is that content alone doesn't make a great racing game. When the driving feels off, the visuals are blurred, and sound design is frankly painful, all the features in the world couldn't save it. And that's where Corvette stumbles. It's certainly ambitious for a budget title, but it never quite hits that level of polish or excitement that makes racers like Need for Speed or Gran Turismo classics. So is Corvette worth revisiting today? If you're a die-hard Corvette fan, someone who just wants to see all the models in one place, maybe. There's a certain nostalgic charm to it. But if you're looking for tight handling, satisfying racing, or even decent visuals, this isn't it. What happens when you take a fantastic rally title and try and squeeze it onto a handheld device? Well, this. The PlayStation Portable, Sony's beautiful little brick of magic, home to UMD movies, some fantastic titles, and a weird feeling of superiority over anyone who owned a DS. And in 2009, Dirt 2 decided to slide its way onto the PSP. Because rally cars, portable, who could resist? Is it a worthy detour into the world of handheld racing, or does it crash harder than me trying to parallel park a Subaru? Or really trying to parallel park anything? Let's find out. First off, a quick history lesson. Dirt 2 was the sequel to Colin McRae Dirt, part of the long-running rally series named after the late great rally legend, Colin McRae. This was the first game after he passed, but for some reason the PSP version doesn't have the tribute to him. Anyway, the console version was a visual showstopper, huge jumps, crazy lighting, and a user interface that looked like a Mountain Dew commercial. The PSP version, well, let's just say it tries its best. It's like ordering a steak and getting a microwavable meatball instead. It's not the same, but at least you're still getting some meat. So, Dirt 2 PSP was developed by UK-based Sumo Digital, a company with a lot of experience in racing, from Sonic and All-Stars Racing to Outrun ports. The PSP version released alongside the home console counterparts in September of 2009. The PSP version of Dirt 2 strips things back down to basics. You've got Quick Race, Multiplayer, Challenge Mode, and the main event, World Tour, aka Career Mode. And when I say Career Mode, it's more like a brief internship into rallying, before they hand you a certificate and kick you out on your way. The events are split into different disciplines like Rallycross, Land Rush, and Trailblazer. Rallycross is your standard lap-based dirt chaos, Land Rush lets you drive what looks like Mad Max rejects, and Trailblazer is you versus the clock. Each race earns you a medal, which you use to progress and unlock car body kits and new races, which sounds somewhat deep until you realise the career mode is about as long as a YouTube ad you can't skip. Seriously, you'll blast through the whole thing faster than you can say Ken Block Gymkhana. On the topic of races, the countdown to start a race is stupidly fast. Not really relevant, but I just thought it was quite funny. There is also a challenge mode, which is really not very fleshed out, but at least it is there to begin with. It has a few different event types. There's one where you have to get so much airtime in 2 minutes, one where you have to drift so far in 2 minutes, a 3-lap time trial, and then knockout racing, where each lap someone gets eliminated. It's not much, but hey, at least the game can go on a bit longer than the 2 hours it takes to beat the main mode. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, simply comment dirt down below. So the car roster is solid, but trimmed down a bit from the console version. You've got Subarus, Fords, Mitsubishis, the usual suspects, all modelled somewhat decently for a handheld. They don't have the detail of their console cousins, but hey, they do vaguely resemble the cars they're claiming to be, and that's what counts. Also, the Ford Escort you get is very overpowered, and I love it very much. There are also quite a lot of tracks in this game. They take you around the world, Croatia, China, and the PSP version even has some exclusive locations, such as the UK. So, sorry to anyone who got the PSP version, you're stuck with England. And while they try to capture that globe-trotting vibe, let's be honest, most of the time it looks like you're racing through a dirt-coloured smoothie. Which leads us nicely onto this. Graphically, Dirt 2 on PSP does alright, in a don't look too closely kind of way. The frame rate is pretty smooth, the cars are recognisable, which puts it ahead of a lot of other handheld racers at the time. However, the environments are a bit, let's go with minimalist. It can be quite difficult at times to tell the difference between the textures that you're actually driving on, because shadows and everything, they get in the way and it's hard to see what you're going on. But overall it's stable, and in a PSP racing game that's basically gold. The controls for Dirt 2 are surprisingly tight. The analog nub, you know, that little soap bubble that gave everyone hand cramps, actually does a decent job with steering. The cars lean arcade more than sim, which fits the handheld vibe perfectly. No one's out here looking for an ultra-precise rally physics while sitting on a bus with their PSP. We just want to go fast, maybe crash into a wall or two, or in my case like 100, and feel like a champion in a world where loading times are longer than the races. The handling of the cars is okay, it certainly takes a lot of getting used to, especially when you're using faster cars like the Ford Escort or the Nissan. It's very hit and miss whether you're going to need to slow down a lot for a corner or whether you can just glide around it. Sometimes it'll feel like a brick, sometimes it'll feel like it's a Scalextric car tied to a track. To me, it does feel like that Sumo Digital tried their best to really capture the vibe of Dirt on the home console. The menu design is still pretty clean, the races still attempt to feel a bit more high energy, and there's still a decent lineup of songs. But the problem is the AI. Oh boy, the AI in this game are not good. Even on the hardest difficulty in the career mode, you will still breeze your way through without much difficulty whatsoever. They crash a lot, they spin out all the time, and it doesn't really feel like you're there to race them. They just kind of feel like a very small obstacle to overtake in like the first 10 seconds of the race, and that's it. I mean, don't get me wrong, they caught up to me a few times, but that's only because I drive like if I successfully overtook them and then didn't spin out or do anything wrong for the rest of the race, then you would literally either lap them or just never see them again. And this seems to be a common practice on the PSP racing games that I've played in this series. The AI are just always useless. There's never been a good AI in this series yet. But then, it is called the worst racing game, so I'm not really holding out high hopes. So, sound design. Let's just say it's there. The engines hum like angry lawnmowers, and the tyre screeches sound like someone doing karaoke as a goose, but it does get the job done. The soundtrack has a nice variety of licensed tracks from the main game, though most of the music plays in the menus, not during the races, which is either good or bad depending on your preference. I personally prefer to have music on during the races, but having seen some of your comments from previous videos, I know a lot of you would prefer to just hear the car sounds, which is completely fair enough. Dirt 2 on the PSP also featured multiplayer. I mean, it only had local wireless multiplayer, but that's still okay. Not great unless you lived in a magical neighborhood where everyone had a PSP and a copy of Dirt 2, but I'm sure someone played local wireless Dirt 2 PSP. In fact, if you did, please let me know in the comments, I'd love to know. And as for replay value, unless you're super into unlocking literally everything or replaying events for better times, the game is a bit thin. It's more like a snack than a full course meal. So what is the final word on Dirt 2 for the PSP? I mean, it's short, it's scrappy, it's not winning any beauty contests, and honestly, it didn't fare too well with critics. The home console games were in the high 80s on Metacritic, whilst this version is sat at a measly 55. But it's a surprisingly okay rally racer you can carry in your pocket, and honestly, did you really want much more from a PSP rally title? Sure, it won't replace the console version, and the career mode might leave you saying, wait, that's it? But for a quick Dirt fix on the go, Dirt 2 is still worth a spin, especially if your PSP still works and you've got a craving for old school handheld chaos. Anyway, that takes us to the end of our look at Dirt 2 PSP.
When people talk about classic kart racers, the same names usually come up over and over again. Mario Kart, Crash Team Racing, Diddy Kong Racing, maybe even Sonic and All-Stars if we're stretching a bit further into the future. But buried underneath those heavy hitters is an entire graveyard of smaller licensed kart racers, games that certainly did not reinvent the wheel and did not dominate sales charts, but still managed to carve out a weird little space in the memories of kids who grew up renting whatever looked fun at their local Blockbuster. And one of those games, a game that feels almost designed to be forgotten to time, is Nicktoons Racing on the original PlayStation. This is a game that absolutely screams budget title, but there were somehow still parts that impressed me. It's short, it's simple, and it's definitely rough around the edges, but it understands exactly what it is, and more importantly, who it's for. So today let's take a look at Nicktoons Racing, how it plays, how it looks, how it sounds, what it did right and what it did wrong. So without further ado, let's jump into the world of Nicktoons Racing. So the game doesn't waste much time trying to tell an elaborate story, and honestly it really doesn't need to. The game opens with a short, fairly low frame rate animated cutscene that looks like it's barely holding itself together at maybe 15 FPS. In it, various Nickelodeon characters receive mysterious letters inviting them to compete in a Grand Prix race for something called the Krusty Krab Big Bun Award. Why is the Krusty Krab hosting a multiversal kart racing tournament involving babies, monsters, beavers, and feral jungle children? Well, don't worry about it. This is pure cartoon logic, and the game fully commits to that energy. There's no villain trying to take over the world, no stakes beyond bragging rights and a big novelty trophy. It's just an excuse to throw a bunch of Nickelodeon characters into go-karts and let them loose. And honestly, that's exactly the kind of thing you want from a game like this. So Nicktoons Racing was developed by Software Creations, at least the PC and PlayStation port was, and was published by Infogrames. It released on Windows PCs and Game Boy Color in 2000, PlayStation in September of 2001, and then the Game Boy Advance at some point in 2002. So for an early 2000s game with 90s Nickelodeon crossovers, the character roster is actually pretty respectable. Your playable cast includes Tommy and Angelica Pickles from Rugrats, SpongeBob and Patrick, CatDog, Ickis, Stimpy, and a mysterious unlockable racer who sounds suspiciously like Plankton. And there are more as well. It's a solid lineup representing a good chunk of Nickelodeon's golden era. Almost every major late 90s Nicktoon is accounted for, except there's nothing from Rocko's Modern Life, and Rocko feels like a perfect candidate for a kart racer. But, oh well, most likely this came down to time, budget, or licensing constraints. Nicktoons Racing was very clearly made quickly and cheaply, and cuts had to be made somewhere. That said, what is here works pretty well. Each character feels distinct, recognizable, and true to their show. Something that becomes even more important once you see their karts. So Nicktoons Racing is not a long game, not even remotely. At its core, the main mode consists of just 3 cups, each containing 4 tracks, so for anyone good at maths, that makes for a total of 12 tracks. You pick your character, select a difficulty once you beat it on easy mode, and race through each cup. If you're even halfway competent at kart races, you can pretty much finish the entire game in about 2 hours. But somehow that doesn't feel too much like a flaw. This is a game that understands its own limitations. It doesn't pad itself out with artificial grinding or endless unlocks. It gives you a tight, focused experience and then promptly gets out of the way. Beyond the cups, there are some additional modes that you can play, such as time trials, there's single races if you don't want to do the cups, a multiplayer mode, and then relay races where you choose 3 characters and swap between each one from lap to lap. So while it's short, there's enough here to justify replaying it, especially if you're playing with friends or revisiting it purely for nostalgia. In the era that this came out, the era of game rentals, this would have been perfect. You rent it on a Friday night, beat it over the weekend, mess around in multiplayer, and then send it promptly back on Monday, completely satisfied. So if you've ever played a kart racer before, Nicktoons Racing will feel pretty familiar. You press X to accelerate, you press square to brake, you have a boost with R1, you can use your items with L1, and R2 hops and initiates a drift. It doesn't try to reinvent anything, there's no complicated mechanics, no experimental systems, it just borrows heavily from Mario Kart and Crash Team Racing, and that's perfectly okay. The drifting, however, is where things start to feel a little rough. Compared to Crash Team Racing or Mario Kart 64, drifting in Nicktoons Racing is noticeably stiffer and much less satisfying. It works, but it never quite feels good. On tighter tracks or more complex layouts, this can lead to awkward cornering, and some very definite frustration when you collide into walls and the car just piles into it. That said, the game is still playable, the controls are responsive, the physics are mostly consistent, and once you get used to the handling, it's easy enough to manage. It's not the smoothest kart racer out there, but it's far from the worst. One area where Nicktoons Racing really shines though is its item design. Every power-up is themed around a specific show or character, and a surprising amount of effort went into making them feel unique and appropriate. Some examples include trash cans from Our Real Monsters, Stimpy's kitty litter, SpongeBob's bubbles, and a homing jellyfish. There's a camera flash, sticky goo, which is very Nickelodeon, and a massive stump which drops on every other racer, and that's from the Angry Beavers. These items don't just function differently, they look and feel like they belong in the Nickelodeon universe. It's clear the developers cared about representing each show properly, even if the rest of the game had to be made on a tight budget. This attention to detail is one of the reasons why the game still kinda holds up today. Thanks to the magic of cartoon logic, none of these characters need to worry about drowning, physics, or even basic safety regulations. Every racer has a completely unique kart design that reflects their personality or show. Tommy rides in the reptile wagon, SpongeBob drives a pineapple, Ickis rides a cockroach. And then there's CatDog, wearing an old-timey driving cap, goggles and scarf, which is a visual that alone justifies their inclusion. These designs are fun, expressive and immediately recognisable. They add a ton of personality to the game and make every race feel visually distinct. Every major Nicktoon represented in the roster gets at least one track, including Rugrats, Hey Arnold, Angry Beavers, CatDog, SpongeBob, so on. Each track is visually distinct enough that you can instantly tell which show it's based on, even without reading the name, which is pretty impressive. The layouts themselves, for the most part, are generally simple, with a few branching paths and hidden shortcuts sprinkled in. Some later tracks get a bit cluttered with tight turns and environmental hazards that can feel overwhelming at times. But none of the tracks overstay their welcome. Races typically last 3 to 4 minutes at most, keeping things fast and engaging enough. Visually, these tracks are pure nostalgia fuel. They capture the look and vibe of their respective shows remarkably well, considering the hardware limitations. And if we're gonna be real, the SpongeBob track in this game honestly is better than the one they made for Sonic Racing Cross Worlds, so make of that what you will. The soundtrack doesn't use direct themes from the cartoons, but instead creates original music inspired by each show's style. Playful strings for Rugrats, and steel guitars and ukuleles for SpongeBob. So on and so forth. It works surprisingly well. The music is cheerful, energetic, and unmistakably cartoony. However, the sound mixing isn't great. Some item sound effects are absurdly loud, character voice lines can also spike in volume, but also some can be lost behind other sounds. It's very weird. There are certain shrieks and whinings that are really irritating, but then half the time you can't even hear Patrick shout that he's sad. Still, all the original voice actors return to voice their characters, which adds a massive amount of authenticity, even if they only say like one thing. It's honestly kind of embarrassing that many modern Nickelodeon racing games couldn't be bothered to do the same. Now that said, there are some incredibly irritating sounds on the main menu, and I guess it's just designed to have that 90s Nickelodeon cartoony feel, but by god it's so annoying. Now, in terms of critical response, there aren't that many reviews of the original PlayStation version out there. However, on the now defunct game rankings, the game held a 70% out of 100. And according to VG Charts, the game would go on to sell over 150,000 units for the original PlayStation, which isn't really that bad considering this was made on such a shoestring budget. At least, presumably it was. Another thing that I find particularly interesting is seeing how much the games we look at are worth today in today's current market. So according to price charting, if you want to get a complete copy of Nicktoons Racing for the PlayStation, you're going to be spending about £20, which is actually more than I was expecting to see. If you want it brand new, then that's 50 quid. This is a pretty solid game. It's not perfect, sometimes the physics are a bit wonky, sometimes you crash into walls, but that's all part of kart racing. It's still a lot of fun. Nicktoons Racing is not a masterpiece. It's short, it's kinda rough, but it succeeds where so many licensed games do kinda fail. It's fun, it respects the source material, it understands its audience, and it doesn't overcomplicate itself. It just gives you a few hours of colourful nostalgic entertainment, and then politely steps aside. In 2005, there was one racing game that asked the only question that really mattered. Ford or Chevrolet? Two brands, 48 cars, and absolutely no mercy. This was a full-blown racing and brand war, and you had to choose a side. Today we are looking at somewhat of a cult classic called Ford vs Chevy, a game that let you burn rubber for brand loyalty, destroy the rivals, and prove once and for all which brand was king of the road. So before we dive into the gameplay, let's just talk about the history of the game. So,
Ford vs Chevy released in November 2005 in America and August of 2006 in PAL regions, releasing on both PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox. It was developed by Technics, who you may know for the absolutely terrible Ride to Hell Retribution. However, they have worked on a variety of different racing games over the years, such as 007 Racing, Street Racing Syndicate, Cartoon Network Racing, and The Fast and the Furious, just to name a few. And depending on where you were in the world, the game was either published by Global Star Software or 2K Games. Anyway, just for reference, the version of the game that we're looking at today is the PlayStation 2 release. So now we've got the history out the way, this is one of those rare games in the worst racing game series where there's actually a plot. It's not much of a plot, but there is one. So what is the premise? Well, you can join either Team Ford or Team Chevy as they revive a legendary rivalry which started way back with the Ford Model T versus the Chevrolet 490. In a slightly jarring cutscene, you are introduced to two old men arguing about which brand is better.
Now see, every year there's races all over town. Yeah, Fords versus Chevys it is. When the Chevys whoop the Fords. Ha! Oh boy.
Because they were the original drivers of those two old cars. As they argue back and forth like Statler and Waldorf from the Muppets, they put the TV on with their grandkids to watch the annual Westington Cup, a fictional racing series built around the Ford and Chevrolet rivalry. As you make your way through the game's story, which is the Westington Cup, you'll get some more cutscenes of the two old men arguing about the different cars. To be honest, the game could have given me no story reason as to why Ford and Chevy are at each other, and I still would have enjoyed it all the same, but it's nice to have some context and some slightly amusing cutscenes. So the main gameplay mode in Ford vs Chevy is the career mode called Westington Cup. So let's break down what you do within the Westington Cup. So there are standard circuit races, that is a 6-person race. You'll have 2 teammates of the brand that you chose, and then there'll be 3 opponents from the opposing brand. As well as standard lap-based circuits, you've also got point-to-point sprint races. Much like another Ford racing game we've looked at in the series, titled Ford Street Racing, Ford vs Chevy also features team-based tactics, so you can command your teammates to either attack or defend. But at no point during my gameplay experience, and I played this from start to end, did it tell me that I could actually do this. It wasn't until I looked at the controls and the different control schemes on the options menu that I happened to see that I could use the D-pad to instruct my teammates. Not that it really makes any difference anyway, because you have to win the race to pass. A teammate can't win it, you have to win it. Anyway, on top of your standard circuit races and point-to-point races, there are also drag races. There's 1 per class in the cup, which means if you're just playing the story, you're only going to do 5 drag races throughout the game anyway. But it's a nice little break up from the standard gameplay, and it is fun and satisfying when you get your gear shifts perfect. And then there are also special missions, most of which are kind of samey, but again a nice break up nonetheless. These will have you doing all sorts of things from breaking billboards to stopping for someone to take photos, delivering invitations. There's one where you have to do some stunts, and my favourite one, which was basically like a small driving test where you have to go between cones, park in different parking bays doing both forward and reverse parking. It was actually kinda cool. So as I briefly mentioned, the Westington Cup is broken down into 5 different classes. To start with, we have Modern Muscle, you move on to Off-Road, then Classic Muscle, then Trucks, and finally Racing Cars. And whilst we're on the topic of cars, let's go through some of the cars that you can drive in Ford vs Chevy. So in the Ford department, we've got off-roaders like the Ford Expedition and the F-150, classics like the Ford Mustang, the Gran Torino, and the Ford GT, and some more recent affairs such as the Ford Focus. And in the Chevrolet department, we've got off-roaders like the Avalanche, and then classics such as the Camaro, Corvette, and some more recent cars, or at least recent for the time, such as the Chevrolet Cobalt. And really, that only scratches the surface of the cars that are available in this game. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, then simply comment which of these two car brands you choose below, Ford or Chevy. As well as a fairly lengthy single player career mode, the game also features a challenge mode as well as multiplayer. So the challenge mode is basically just the place where you can retry different events from the story to get the fastest possible time or the best possible score. It doesn't really add anything too much to the game, but it's nice to have something extra, even if there aren't any actual new challenges. And then in the multiplayer department, we have split screen for up to 2 players, although you are limited on the maps that you can choose and the cars that you can drive. It was still kind of fun though, and I know full well I would have enjoyed that split screen mode so much more when I was a kid. As well as this game actually featured online and LAN multiplayer for up to 6 players, which was pretty cool for a slightly lesser known, more budget title from this era. I'm curious, did anyone play this online back in the day? If you did, please let me know, I'd love to hear about your experience. So that's what Ford vs Chevy has to offer in terms of its gameplay modes. What is the actual handling like? Well, the game definitely goes for a more arcadey approach. The physics are very loose, gravity kind of feels all over the place, and no matter what surface that you're driving on, it can feel a bit like an ice rink because there's somewhat of an emphasis on drifting around for score to get boost. It certainly took some getting used to, but after several hours with the game, I did eventually get there and even begin to appreciate what the game was trying to go for. It can be very satisfying to pull off a big drift to completely max out your boost bar, but on the other hand, it's also incredibly easy to just spin out or crash into a wall. And if you do that, then you don't get the score from the drift you were trying to do. So throughout your races you will accumulate points, and these points are earned from winning races, drifting, getting airtime, overtaking, drafting, pretty much doing anything in a race that isn't negative. These points can then be spent on upgrades for your car or buying new cars, although we'll get to that a little bit later. So whilst the game goes for a more arcadey approach in terms of its handling, it actually has a surprisingly realistic crash damage model for a 2005 PS2 title. And again, much like Ford Street Racing, you do have to use your points or money earned to repair the car, and you will actually notice significant performance issues with your car the more you start to damage it, so it is important to either not crash or repair your car before you start a new race. So I mentioned you could spend your points on upgrades, and oh man, there are a lot of upgrades in this game. There are over 150 different car parts you can get from over 20 different manufacturers. You can pretty much upgrade every aspect of your car in terms of performance. Transmission, brakes, exhaust, it's all there. However, what isn't there in this game is super deep visual customization. If you're a big fan of Need for Speed Underground and that level of customization, this game doesn't really do that so well. You can change the paint, and you can change the rims, and that's literally it. Now, don't get me wrong, not having that visible customization doesn't ruin the game for me, it just would have been nice because there were so many performance upgrades already. Anyway, how does Ford vs Chevy hold up in terms of its visuals? Well, in terms of its car models, I would say very well, even 20 years later. Car models are nice, reflections are good, and they're pretty detailed. And with 48 different cars to choose from, you can't really go wrong. In terms of the tracks and the world that you're driving through, for the most part, that's also a pretty big success as well. With some of the city tracks really feeling alive, you drive past a theme park and you can see a roller coaster going over you. It all looks quite nice, and the textures are pretty decent as well. There are a couple of moments where it doesn't look quite as pretty as it should, such as when you're in farmland, the grass textures just look horrible. But compared to some of the other titles we've looked at in this series, I would say the visuals hold up pretty well. In terms of its sound design, the car engine sounds, the tyre sounds, all of that is pretty decent. It's not terrible, it's not great, it's just kinda there.
Great control there.
The game also features a somewhat okay soundtrack, with a variety of different songs, but for some reason the game tends to just loop the same couple over and over again, and there was one specifically during the off-road section that just kept coming back and would not go away, and that was called Dancing Shoes. So I would recommend, if you are going to check this game out, turn the soundtrack off. It gets quite old. Now, in terms of the critical response towards Ford vs Chevy, it was kind of mixed. There aren't many responses to go off of, but the average is approximately about 60 out of 100, with some low reviews going as far as 50. I don't think this is a bad game at all, but in terms of its review scores, I don't think that it helped that Ford vs Chevy, at least in America, launched within the same week as the Xbox 360 and the absolutely fantastic Project Gotham Racing 3, which, you know, is just a far superior, absolutely fantastic game. I mean, they're not quite the same, but if you were looking for a racing game coming out that month, you would choose Project Gotham Racing 3. The PlayStation Portable promised console-quality gaming in the palm of your hand. And in 2005, Sony brought Formula 1 to the system with F1 Grand Prix. But does this handheld racer stand the test of time, or is it just a pit stop on the road to better F1 licensed games? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So before we start tearing this game a new one, let's dive into its history. So F1 Grand Prix, which was also known as Formula 1 2005 Portable in Japan, was released in September 2005 for the PSP, so not that long after the console launched. It was actually developed by Traveller's Tales, now known as TT Games, as in those guys that do all the LEGO games, and was published by Sony Computer Entertainment. The game featured all the initial driver lineups for the 2005 F1 World Championships, so drivers like Michael Schumacher, Ralf Schumacher, Fernando Alonso, Jenson Button, and Mark Webber, just to name a few. As well as this, it also featured substitute drivers such as Pedro de la Rosa and Anthony Davidson. The game also featured all 19 tracks from that season, including Australia, Malaysia, Bahrain, Spain, Canada, and of course Silverstone here in England. So when you boot the game up, you get a cool flashy cutscene with a bunch of different cars, and then you're introduced to a nice sleek menu. The F1 branding is there, and there are a few different options for you to jump into, so before I dive into each one, I will just give a brief overview. So you've got the option for a quick race, which is fairly self-explanatory. It's just a random race with random settings. That's literally it. Then there's an events section where you have a few different options, such as time attack, which is again self-explanatory, single Grand Prix, which allows you to do a full Grand Prix weekend, including the practice and qualifying as well as the race, and then scenario mode, which we'll go a bit deeper into later. The game also has a multiplayer option where you can play with up to 8 players online, which is pretty cool. And then you've also got something called TV mode, which is really the most pointless addition to a game I've ever seen. It just allows you to watch a single race as if it were on TV. That's it. You just sit on your PSP and watch the gameplay itself. No commentary, nothing else, just cars going round. I mean, I guess it's a cool idea. I'm not really sure what the point in it is, and if you did use this, please let me know in the comments down below. Anyway, that leaves us with the championship mode, the main meat of the game. At first it seems promising. Pick your team, jump into a full F1 season, and fight for the title for both yourself and the constructor. But almost immediately the problems start to show. The difficulty balance is completely ridiculous. You only get one difficulty choice at the start, and that is easy mode, where the AI barely puts up a fight, and you could make the biggest mistake in qualifying and you'll still probably qualify first. On Monaco, I spun out, hit a wall, reversed and put myself back, and I still qualified first. And even if somehow you make the biggest mistake in the world and don't qualify first, you are almost guaranteed to pass everyone on the first lap anyway. Now, unfortunately, to unlock anything above easy, you have to play through the entire season on easy. It's a design choice that makes the early hours of the game drag on, and it really doesn't respect your time. Maybe if the game had started on easy and worked me up after the first few races, I probably wouldn't be complaining so much, but I had to do a full 19 races with just no challenge whatsoever. It was incredibly boring. Thankfully on easy the races are short because they're only 3 laps, and you don't even have to do qualifying or practice if you don't want to, although if you don't do qualifying you will start from the back, but as I mentioned, it's not very hard to get back to the front. However, once you pass through the easy mode, that's when the game finally starts to get interesting. Once you get to medium, it unlocks weather conditions, and honestly the weather conditions are pretty impressive, the rain effects are good, and it kind of affects your handling, but we'll get to that later. Medium difficulty also unlocks pit stops and tyre degradation, so there are actually some tactics involved now, although it's still only 5 laps. Thankfully on this difficulty it does start to provide a bit of a challenge. It's still not difficult, don't get me wrong, but you're not 100% guaranteed to qualify first, and sometimes you will actually get overtaken. Eventually, when you unlock the hard difficulty, then the AI will suddenly wake up and drive, and on top of this, penalties will be unlocked as well. I mean, I guess it's nice to have a sense of progression, but I'm buying a game like this to play Formula 1. How it's meant to be played. I don't want to have to play through something that isn't fun to get to the thing I bought the game for to begin with. Now, one area where the game tried something new was scenario mode. Instead of a full race, you're placed into short challenges, such as having a quick pit stop, having damaged brakes and making it to the pit stop, or regaining positions under poor weather conditions. It's a great idea, especially for a portable version of F1 where you might only have a few minutes to play. Unfortunately though, it does feel undercooked. The challenges are fun for like 5 minutes, but they don't evolve enough to stay interesting. You play a few, you'll get the gist, and then there isn't really much reason to come back. It's a case of a really cool concept but very poor execution. So how about the driving itself? Well, it's complicated. The cars look and sound like Formula 1 machines, but they don't really feel like them. The handling has a strange floaty quality, and the physics don't always behave the way you'd expect. One of the strangest issues is how often the cars seem to catch air. In real F1, these cars are basically glued to the track with downforce, unless there's a major mistake. But in F1 Grand Prix, it feels like you're driving something far lighter. Just going on certain tracks, the roads just feel bumpy and they can launch your car and turn your steering drastically left or right in a way that just feels wrong. It breaks the immersion a bit and reminds you that you are just playing a game, not simulating the world's most technical motorsport. It's one of those handling models where you can get used to it and it does get easier, but there's always going to be moments where it's just blatantly something wrong with the game, and you'll end up just having an accident that's not your fault. The other thing with the handling is that this game requires a lot of precision driving, and with the little analog nub and no analog triggers, it can be quite hard because the AI can turn and brake on a moment's notice, but you can't really do that so much. Again, it doesn't ruin the game because they've done the best with what they had, but it is quite frustrating at points. However, where the game does deliver is in presentation. For a 2005 PSP title, F1 Grand Prix looks solid. The cars are well modelled, the tracks are recognisable, and the game runs at a good frame rate for the hardware. Of course it doesn't compare to console F1 games from the same era, but on a handheld screen it got the job done. As I mentioned, the weather effects are a nice touch, rain and changing track conditions add some variety to the visuals, even if they don't impact the gameplay too much. But for me, seeing these little details on this system was pretty impressive. Now in terms of the sound effects, the cars sound pretty good. There is a licensed soundtrack, although I only actually heard one song from it the entire time I was playing, and that was Better Living Through Chemistry by Queens of the Stone Age, which I'm not going to play in this video because it is a copyrighted song. But for some reason, out of the few songs on the soundtrack, it's the only one I heard, on every race and every qualifying session. In the end, I just turned the music off because it was really annoying. Now, in terms of the critical response to F1 Grand Prix, there aren't that many reviews out there, but the ones I were able to find were pretty average. For example, Eurogamer gave it a 6 out of 10, And that seems to be the general consensus across the board. The game is decent, it's just nowhere near perfect. Now, I also wasn't really able to find any reliable sales figures for the game, but I have found the value of the game today as per price charting, and for a complete used copy, this is for a PAL region PSP copy, you're looking at about £5.73, or brand new, never opened, like 20 years later, £12. I always find it really interesting to see the value of some of these games that I cover on the channel, because there are always some terrible games that end up being worth loads, but I'm yet to find one in this series. F1 Grand Prix is a game with plenty of ambition, but not enough refinement. The core championship mode is dragged down by the poor difficulty design, the handling never quite nails the feel of the sport, and while that scenario mode did show some creativity, it just doesn't go far enough. But at the same time, it's not without merit. Back in 2005, having a full F1 season in your pocket was a really cool thing. For fans of the sport, it offered a way to race as their favourite drivers anywhere, anytime. And visually, again, it was a decent job. At the end of the day, F1 Grand Prix is a product of its time. It was a showcase of what the PSP could do back in its early days, but not a game that holds up particularly well.
When you think of Ferrari, a few things probably come to mind immediately. Speed, luxury, Italian engineering, and let's be honest here, money. Ferrari is a brand that's always been associated with excess, prestige, and performance at the highest possible level. It's the kind of car you see roaring down a Monaco street or sitting behind velvet ropes at a car show. Not exactly something you associate with a plastic handheld from 2004. And yet here we are. Today we are looking at Ferrari Challenge Trofeo Pirelli for the Nintendo DS, a game that attempted to bring authentic Ferrari racing simulation to one of Nintendo's most unconventional platforms. This isn't Mario Kart, this isn't Burnout, it's not even Need for Speed. This is an attempt at a serious licensed Ferrari racing sim on a system better known for brain age and touchscreen minigames. So the question is simple. Does Ferrari Challenge actually succeed at delivering a racing experience on the Nintendo DS? Or is it an ambitious handheld port that collapses under the weight of its own realism? Let's find out. To better understand Ferrari Challenge on the DS, you really need to understand the context it released into. By the late 2000s, racing games on home consoles were thriving. Gran Turismo, Forza Motorsport, and even more arcade-leaning titles were pushing realism, physics, and graphic fidelity further every year. Handhelds, on the other hand, struggled. The Nintendo DS was powerful enough for its time, but it was not designed with high-fidelity simulation. Its strengths were creativity, accessibility, and innovation, dual screens, touchscreen controls, stylus input. Racing simulations were not intended for this platform. Outside of Mario Kart DS, which obviously leaned fully into arcade chaos, most DS races were simplified ports or watered down versions of console games. Ferrari Challenge is interesting because it doesn't try to dumb itself down, instead it takes the opposite approach. It attempts to replicate Ferrari's official Trofeo Pirelli racing series, complete with licensed cars, real tracks, and a focus on driving technique rather than spectacle. This wasn't just a Ferrari-branded arcade racer slapped together for quick sales, it had Ferrari's official approval literally stamped on the box, and that sets the expectations just kind of a little bit high. So this version of Ferrari Challenge was developed by Firebrand Games and published by System 3, releasing across July and August 2008. We have looked at several Firebrand games on the channel before, as they've ported lots of racing games to the Nintendo DS, as well as developing some specifically for it. We have looked at Race Driver Create and Race, Race Driver Grid, Trackmania DS, Need for Speed Nitro, so on and so forth. They've done a lot. It's not all good, but it's not all bad, so that doesn't set the expectations too high for this game. Booting up Ferrari Challenge on the DS, the first thing I noticed was the tone. There was no flashy intro cinematic, no bombastic soundtrack, no neon menus screaming extreme illegal speed. Instead, everything kind of felt restrained, kind of professional, maybe almost sterile. Menus are clean and functional, the fonts are simple, and the presentation feels closer to a motorsport broadcast than a video game. And honestly, that kinda works. It immediately signals that this is a game that wants to be taken seriously. The title screen music is subtle, the menus load kinda quickly, and the game wastes very little time getting you behind the wheel. But once you actually start racing, the reality sets in, because Ferrari Challenge is asking a lot from a very small screen. So let's talk about the most important part of any racing game: how it feels to drive. Ferrari Challenge uses a traditional control setup, D-pad for steering, face buttons for acceleration and braking, and there's no touchscreen steering gimmick here, which is probably for the best. The handling model leans heavily towards simulation. Cars have weight, momentum matters, braking too late will absolutely punish you. As you'll probably see from the gameplay footage, I got punished a lot. Oversteer is a constant threat if you're sloppy. This is not a game where you can just mash the accelerator and bounce off walls. The corners kind of demand respect, and that's both the game's greatest strength and its biggest weakness. On a large TV or a monitor setup, judging braking distance and corner entry is like second nature. On the Nintendo DS's tiny screen, or emulated, it's a bit harder. Tracks can appear deceptively flat, turns can sneak up on you, and depth perception is somewhat limited. You often find yourself misjudging how fast you can safely take a corner. Not because the physics are wrong, but because the visuals don't communicate enough information quickly. Still, when you do get it right, the satisfaction is real. Nailing a clean lap, overtaking AI opponents without too much contact in this game, feels genuinely quite rewarding. This is a game that doesn't hand you the win, you have to earn it. One of the most surprising and frankly best features of Ferrari Challenge Trofeo Pirelli is its training mode. Instead of throwing you straight into championship races, the game introduces you to a structured tutorial system focused on driving fundamentals. You're taught proper braking technique, corner entry and exit, smooth acceleration, overtaking without contact, staying within track limits, or at least that's what it's trying to teach you. Each challenge scores you based on your performance. Clean driving earns points, and mistakes deduct points. And this is important because these mechanics largely disappear once you leave the training mode. The game doesn't hold your hand during the races, there are no glowing race lines, no assist popping up mid-corner. If you didn't pay attention in training, then you're probably going to struggle. But that's what makes the training mode so effective. It feels almost like a driving school, and for a handheld racing game that's kinda rare. In many ways, the training mode to me was more engaging than the main championship itself. Chasing higher scores, refining technique, and mastering each lesson has an almost arcade-like appeal. Ironically, it's where the game feels the most alive. There's a scoring system in the training mode ranked by bronze, silver, or gold, which is based off of how high of a score you get. Don't get me wrong, it's not perfect, but we'll get to why that is a bit later with the AI. Unfortunately, not every idea Ferrari Challenge introduces is a winner. Introducing the card system. As you complete training challenges and just races, you earn collectible cards featuring Ferrari cars with various stats. These cards can be used in a card battle minigame, where you essentially compare stats against another player or the AI. Higher stats win, lower stats lose. And that's it. There's no strategy, no deck building, no meaningful rewards. It feels like a feature that exists purely because someone thought, hey, kids love top trumps. The card game doesn't enhance the racing, it doesn't unlock anything meaningful, and it doesn't really affect progression in a satisfying way. At its best, it's a novelty, but at its worst, it's a complete waste of development time that should have been spent perfecting the AI or just making the game better. This is one of those features that sounds better on paper than it actually plays. Ferrari Challenge does at least deliver when it comes to track variety. There's a respectable selection of real-world circuits and layouts, each with its own character. Some tracks are tight and technical, others favour high-speed straights, and some demand perfect braking zones. You've got tracks like Monza, Spa, Silverstone. Obviously not all of them have the names of the tracks that they actually are, most likely due to licensing, but they are here. And there was something, to me, weirdly interesting about seeing tracks like Spa or Monza on a Nintendo DS. As someone who spent so much time on the F1 games on PC, this just felt a bit weird, but in a cool way. That said, the repetition does set in faster than you'd expect. Why? Because every race uses essentially identical cars. There's no tuning, no tyre compounds, no engine upgrades. You're racing opponents with the same performance ceiling as you, just painted differently. While this ensures fairness, it also strips away long-term depth. Once you've mastered the handling model on one of a few different cars, there's very little left to experiment with. So when you're actually out on the track, the game only has one point of view for you to play in, and that is the front bumper view, the one that's quite close to the ground. Now, this does give a good sense of speed, but it would have been nice to have a few different points of view, or at least a third-person point of view, because at the end of the day, this is still a DS game. However, there is a pretty good replay system in place that allows you to view your full race once you've completed it, and it tries to emulate being a TV camera, so it jumps between different points of view from the side, from the back, from your bumper view. It's quite cool. It's a bit janky and car models glitch about in this, and there was actually one replay where the game just broke and my car just stopped driving and turned into a wall, which for the record is not what happened in the actual race, but it's pretty cool that there is a replay system at all here. Now, I did mention some issues with the AI earlier on in the video, and now let's talk about it. The problem with the AI is that, well, it's a mix of the collision detection and just over-aggression. So the collision detection in this game isn't great. You'll see sometimes in the footage that the car glitches about a little bit when it's made contact with another car, and 95% of the time the only person that's going to suffer from this is you, not the AI. There are times when I'm braking around a corner and the AI is behind me, doesn't react to you braking at all, it just continues on its pre-programmed racing line and smashes into the back of you. It's just some traditional classic racing game AI that just doesn't know how to react to anything else around it. It's certainly not the worst AI we've ever seen in this worst racing game series, but it's definitely not the best either. Has its ups, has its downs, but it definitely could have used some more time in the oven. You know, maybe rather than making some pointless top trumps card game mode, we could have had better AI. Visually, Ferrari Challenge is impressive considering the hardware. The car models are okay, they're recognisable, you can tell one Ferrari from another, which isn't always a given on the DS. Tracks curve mostly naturally, elevation changes are usually visible, and the skyboxes are decent and dynamic. But there are compromises. Track surfaces can look blocky, especially mid-corner. Off-road textures resemble something closer to cheese puffs than gravel. Environmental detail is definitely sparse. But there's also no visible car damage, no dents, no scratches, no visual feedback beyond slowing down and occasionally glitching about. This removes a sense of impact and consequence. Still, the game runs smoothly for the most part. I had the odd frame rate dip when going up a hill with a bunch of cars on the screen at the same time, but for the most part, it's good. And in my opinion, the stability matters more than flashy visuals, especially on a DS game. Now, the sound design in this game is a bit of a mixed bag. Engine noises are surprisingly convincing for DS hardware, each car has a distinct tone, and rev changes are communicated somewhat clearly. Tyre squeal exists, but it certainly lacks punch, and it's pretty much the same 1 second sound on loop. Crashes feel muted, as I've mentioned, but the music is minimal and unobtrusive, which suits the simulation vibe, but certainly doesn't leave any lasting impression. So overall the audio does its job, but it never really elevates the experience. So Ferrari Challenge is not an easy game. mistakes are punished, consistency is rewarded, and the AI opponents, although quite irritating, are still competent. But once you finish the championship and unlock everything, the replay value drops off sharply, like off a cliff. Without customization, online competition, or, deep progression systems, there's little reason to keep coming back unless you genuinely love the driving. So how does Ferrari Challenge on the DS hold up in terms of its critical response? Well, on Metacritic, the game holds a score of 65 out of 100, putting it in the mixed or average zone, with high reviews as high as 80 out of 100 and lows of 58 out of 100. So nothing super jarring, but nothing particularly good either. Critics praised the game's visuals, but also criticised the lack of content, options, and damage. Now, unfortunately, this version of Ferrari Challenge did not sell well at all, with the game roughly estimated to have sold about 40,000 copies, which is not very good. Interestingly, the Wii version of this game would go on to sell 500,000 copies, which to me is actually kinda crazy. Anyway, those stats are from VG Charts. The early 2000s, a simpler time, a time when LEGO said, yes, we know children love building things, but what if instead they didn't? And thus, LEGO Drome Racers was born. This is a game based on futuristic racing, missile warfare, and the kind of car customization where you technically have choices, but really you're just choosing between 3 different flavors of total disappointment. So today we're going to go through the world of Drome Racers, where cars can float, physics fear commitment, and for some reason the villain is named Dromulus, which sounds less like a racing mastermind and more like a Power Rangers villain that somehow got rejected. So before we jump into the gameplay, let's just look at a little bit of history about how this game even came to be. So back in the late 90s and early 2000s, LEGO was experimenting quite a lot. They already had LEGO Racers 1 and 2, fan favourites that were full of charm and creative brick-by-brick car construction, which one day we will look at on the channel because I've really been meaning to get to them. But that wasn't enough. LEGO saw the success of their Racers toy line, these weird, ultra-specific, almost aggressively non-brick cars, and thought, yeah, let's make a game out of those. Kids love building cars that can only be one thing. So they handed the keys to Attention to Detail, the same developers behind Roll Cage, which was a racing game best described as what if Hot Wheels sets had a total death wish. It's important to note that Attention to Detail were the primary developers behind LEGO Racers 2 as well, so they'd already been working with the LEGO brand, and theoretically they got everything right in 2, so that should have continued into Drome Racers? ? So Attention to Detail said, cool, but what if the cars are LEGO, except they don't really act like LEGO, and instead of goofy kart-style antics, we go full futuristic race war. And LEGO just kinda went, yeah, sure, why not, whatever, we don't care. So with the groundwork set, let's go over the slightly strange lore of Drome Racers. So in the distant futuristic year of 2015, the world has apparently given up on things like politics, economics, and infrastructure because everyone's attention is now solely focused on the Drome, a giant multi-biome racing dome run by a man named Dromulus, who I guess sits upon a chrome throne feeding on the tears of the rookie drivers that have been lost to the Drome. He decides where and when races happen. Apparently racers get like 0 input, no schedule, no routes, just hey, you're racing in the frozen mountains now, so good luck with that. It's the racing equivalent of being kidnapped and dropped into a new ecosystem like a very confused deer. But hey, as far as premises go, we've certainly had worse. I think it's quite an interesting setup that allows the game to give you lots of different environments to race through, in theory. So career mode is built around something called MCR. And no, for you emos like myself out there, that's not My Chemical Romance, that is in fact multi-challenge races. That sounds complex, but in practice it's basically LEGO saying, what if a race was actually just a couple of races duct taped together? Each MCR starts with a drag race, because nothing screams LEGO like tuning a dragster, revving too hard, and then blowing up.
Drag races are short and require a weirdly high amount of precision, and these determine your starting position for the first race in the cup. Which sounds fair until you realise the gear shifting sensitivity is so tight, you could sneeze and accidentally go from first to nuking your car. Genuinely, the amount of time it took me to nail this was way too long, almost embarrassingly too long, which might be a skill issue, but still, not ideal. Anyway, then the actual races begin, and here's the twist. Your start time depends on your total time from previous races, obviously excluding the first one, which is the drag. So if you're 4 seconds ahead overall, you'll start the next race 4 seconds early. It's like Mario Kart if Mario said, nah, you're good, go ahead, I'll catch up. It's certainly a unique way of doing things. I want to say clever, but I don't think that would be the right word. Anyway, the AI, for the most part, somehow finds a way to rubber band itself back up to near you anyway, like a clingy ex, so that head start doesn't really matter too much anyway. Alright, so the handling. Let's talk about it. The handling in Drome Racers feels like the game was coded by two completely different teams who never met each other and communicated exclusively through faxes with lots of typos. There are two types of cars, road cars and off-road cars. Now, logic dictates road cars are good on road, and off-road cars are good on off-road. But Drome Racers takes that logic and firmly rejects it. Road cars handle like they're made of soap, butter, and some weirdly bad intentions. They understeer, oversteer, fishtail, and occasionally attempt to drift sideways into walls like they're trying to escape the drome. Even slow corners feel like you're trying to steer a shopping cart with one bad wheel at least 150 miles per hour. Meanwhile, the off-road cars, which is the more enjoyable part of the game because of this, handle perfectly. They're tight and responsive. They handle like the developers accidentally swapped the physics files between the road and off-road, and then just went, yeah, sure. And then there's the floatiness. Everything floats. You hit a jump, you float. You nudge a wall, you hover. Another car hits you, well, off the space for you. So the game also has some weapons. So Drome Racers channels its roll cage roots with a selection of weapons that range from kind of annoying to why would you do this to me? There are homing missiles that never miss, forward shots that pretty much always miss, and dropped items that exist solely to ruin someone's day, if they actually ever land on it. Using weapons is fun, to be fair. Dodging weapons is, well, not so fun. In fact, barely even possible. But the homing missiles, nope, there's no counterplay, there's no shield, no dodge. Just an audio cue, a brief moment of like a few seconds of reflection, and then you just spin out, or flip. One particularly hilarious flaw in my opinion is when you hit another driver with a missile, their spinning carcass will often just hit directly into you, meaning you get punished for just playing the game and being successful in doing so, which, you know, seems balanced. Now I know you're thinking, well, Kledge, this is a LEGO racing game, so at least I can build my own dream car. And the game says, no, you can pick tyre type A, B, or C. And that's about as much creativity as you get. You can pick one set of tyres, one of a handful of chassis, and one of a few body shells. And that's kind of it. So you basically just make small, medium, or big car, and that's the entire game. It's like having a giant Lego bucket but only being allowed to build the spaceship on the box because all the pieces are hyper specialized and shaped like dragon wings. Make that make sense. Upgrades exist and they're universal. You buy a turbo upgrade, every car gets turbo. You upgrade the engine, well, congratulations, your entire garage has now been blessed with that engine upgrade. It's convenient but also hilariously unrealistic. Imagine tuning one car and suddenly all the other cars in your garage just get better, as if by magic. However, I have been moaning a little bit, and it's not all bad with Drome Racers. There's parts of it I actually enjoyed. One thing the game absolutely nails is the cars. These things look really good. If you owned the real LEGO sets, seeing them in motion was like watching your childhood fantasies come to life at like 150 miles per hour, which is just awesome. The environments are surprisingly gorgeous. There's really nice hills, dusty deserts, snowy mountains, futuristic cities which are slightly less interesting, but they all look sharp and surprisingly detailed. And there's even good particle effects. Like, I'm genuinely really surprised with how good this game looks, considering how old it is. There's even a tornado on one track that looks so good you'll wonder why the rest of the game doesn't get this level of love. Even though if the tornado itself is somewhat frustrating to get around because it throws you around, like it's taking you out of Kansas. But then there are the humans in your garage. These poor souls look like they escaped from a PS1 cutscene and wandered into a PS2 game looking for some help. Their animations are stiff, their faces are blank, and their lip syncing is just non-existent. It's like the developers ran out of budget and then just put in some wax museum figures and went, yeah, well, hopefully no one notices. They also have really funny names, so your engineer is called Chicane. And what's her middle name? Through Goes Hamilton. And then there's also the guy that you have to go to save your data, and he's just called Slot. I have no further words for that one, just Slot. The sound design in Drome Racers is, well, perfectly adequate. Engines roar, tyres screech, weapons fly past, explosions go boom. All the boxes are checked. The soundtrack mixes 2000s cheese metal with surprisingly decent electro-orchestral tracks. Some songs slap, some songs politely tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, don't forget me, I also exist. It's not exactly iconic, but in my opinion, it at least does the job. Now in terms of critical response, the PlayStation 2 version of Drome Racers, which by the way released in November 2002, holds a 57 out of 100 on Metacritic. The other main console versions of the game, which as far as I can tell are pretty much all the same, the GameCube version holds a 54, the PC version holds a 65, and the Xbox version, if it ever released, didn't get enough critical responses to get a score anyway. There was an alternative Game Boy Advance port which ironically ended up being the highest scorer at 73, but obviously is not the same game. Anyway, the game also has a user score on the PS2 port, and that is sadly a lot lower with a 3 out of 10. So, people do not remember this game fondly, it would seem. Anyway, the game would go on to sell just over 100,000 units on the PS2, and these figures are from VG charts. Something else that I always find very interesting is finding out roughly how much the game is worth in today's market. So, for a complete copy of the PS2 version of Drome Racers, at least here in PAL regions, it's going to cost you about £12, which is actually a little bit more than I was expecting. But if you're after just the disc, then you only have to spend about £2. The PlayStation 2 had no shortage of racing games, from juggernauts like Gran Turismo 4 to niche little oddities like Enthusia Professional Racing. There really was something for everyone. But in 2006, a lesser known title quietly rolled onto the scene, Corvette Evolution GT, a game that blended European touring cars with RPG mechanics and forced American branding. This week, the Sacred Wheel of Worst Racing Games has chosen Corvette Evolution GT. So, what exactly was Evolution GT? A hidden gem, a licensed cash grab, or something in between? Let's find out. Evolution GT was developed by Milestone, an Italian studio with a strong background in motorsport games. You might know them today for games like Ride or the MotoGP series, as well as the absolutely fantastic Hot Wheels Unleashed games. On a side note, there was a DS version developed by Island Racing Studios, but this would not be released until 2 years later, in 2008, and we will not be covering that today. So, originally released in Europe simply as Evolution GT, the game featured a variety of real-world cars and circuits with a serious tone and simulation-ish inspired gameplay. However, when it arrived in North America, things changed. Because yes, the North American version received a rebrand emphasizing one iconic name, Corvette. This was largely a marketing move. Despite the title, the game is not exclusively about Corvettes, and really isn't any different to the Evolution GT version we got in Europe. In fact, Corvettes only really make up a small portion of the car list. So what kind of game is this? Well, at its core, Corvette Evolution GT is a simcade racer, a hybrid of simulation physics and arcade-style racing. Cars feel grounded with weight and momentum, but the handling is forgiving enough for casual players, for the most part. So when you get into the game, you end up with a tutorial cutscene featuring real-world driver Gabriele Tarquini, who explains the basics of racing and the mechanics of the game to you. Interestingly enough, he is only dubbed in one language: English.
Hi guys, I'm Gabriele Tarquini. Everyone dreams of being a champion race driver. But what does being a race driver mean? Winning races and championships is easier said than done.
The game has a couple of different modes for you to try. You have Quick Race, where you can choose any track, any weather and any car. You have multiplayer, which is the same thing but split screen, and then we have the career mode. And the career mode is where the game shines, because here you don't choose your cars, you build your driver. This is where the RPG elements come in. You train stats like reflexes, vision, braking, and even intimidation. Yes, intimidation. If you are scary enough, the AI drivers will actually give way and panic when you're behind them. When you start your career, you have to choose a driver name, and you also then have to join a team. There are a variety of real-world branded teams that you can join, and of course I had to join Pepsi Max. So my driver is called Chump, and he is a driver for Pepsi Max. So as I briefly mentioned, yes, the cars do feel quite grounded. Each car that you drive feels different, brakes differently, turns differently, and for the most part, it's going for a realistic style of handling, and it works pretty well. Am I good at it? Not really. Did it annoy me a little bit? Yes, but it works very well. Don't get me wrong, there were a couple of moments throughout my hours spent on this game where the handling felt very mixed. Suddenly I was very light and floaty, and on the next corner I'd suddenly feel like I was driving a tank. But overall, it's pretty solid. Races take place on real-world circuits, and this time it's not just about winning races, it's about progressing your driver through a motorsport journey. Over time, you'll unlock new teams, car classes, and rivalries, and it creates a sense of momentum that few other PS2-era racers attempted at such a level of depth. Now, of course, because this is a worst racing games episode, there's always going to be a but. And the big but here is the AI. So the AI has been created in such a way that they're supposed to feel like they are real racers. And it kind of works too well because they make so many mistakes that feel like they're human that they cause a lot of problems to your race. Quite regularly, they'll slam into the back of you, swerve into the side of you, even on a straight piece of track. Whilst at first it can be quite fun trying to glide your way through all the crowds of AI, sometimes they just crash in such a ridiculously unnecessary way that it just really ruins the race for you, because if you make one or two mistakes in the game, then it could be race over for you. On top of this, I previously mentioned the intimidation mechanic, which in idea is kind of cool, but in reality doesn't work that well. When you've intimidated an opponent, they start swerving all over the place, making it harder to overtake them than it was to just accelerate past them without the intimidation. And then the intimidation also works on you, so when you do get intimidated by an opponent, you end up with a very, very blurry vision, making it very hard to see what's coming up. Thankfully, there is a mini-map that you can use to kind of guess the corners, but sometimes it can cause a lot of issues. Again, I appreciate the idea behind it, and I think it is a very cool mechanic that just hasn't been implemented very well. Now, as well as an intimidation mechanic, there's also a rewind mechanic that seems a bit more fair than it was in newer games such as Forza, where it has a charge up and a limit to how much you can rewind. So if you do make a mistake, you can try and rectify it, but if you don't have enough of the stat for the rewind, then you won't be able to go back far enough. Which again, I quite like the way this is implemented, but a lot of the time your crashes will be caused by idiotic AI, and no amount of rewinding will be able to fix that. Now, much like the entry we looked at last week, Corvette Evolution GT features a damage mechanic, with full damage models to the cars. It works pretty well, It doesn't affect your car's performance in the race, but if your health bar does go to 0, you are out of the race. Which is fine if you don't make mistakes, but you're less likely to make a mistake than you are to be crashed into by one of the fellow racers. Now if you've made it this far into the video, simply just comment Corvette in the comment section down below. Now, despite the name, the car list goes far beyond Chevrolet. You'll find vehicles from Vauxhall, Audi, Mercedes, Renault, and yes, of course, a few different types of Corvette. Although they only make up 4 out of the 35 car roster. This weird mix gives the game a unique identity, European race cars alongside American muscle. Each car, as I mentioned, handles noticeably differently with varied acceleration, braking, and turning behaviour. The game also features a large list of tracks in real-world locations such as London, Barcelona, and Valencia. It's a nice surprise to see attention given to technical layouts that favour driver skill over raw speed. Is every track good? No, because there's like nearly 30 of them. But for the most part, a lot of them are very good and there's a nice level of variation so you don't get bored. Well, at least not bored of the tracks. Evolution GT isn't about collecting 400 cars like Gran Turismo, instead it's about mastering the few cars that you do have. Each victory earns experience points that you can spend on stat growth in a variety of different areas. This is the driver upgrade system, which I have touched on briefly already. It makes every race feel different. Want to be a sharp passer, improve your reflexes, want better cornering under pressure, train your braking and steering, want to spook rivals into making mistakes, well then, as I said, boost your intimidation. It's a rewarding loop that encourages skill development and different styles of racing, not just crash your way through, like I tend to do. On top of this, you can collect gear from winning cups such as new helmets, suits, and gloves. These also affect your stats in a variety of ways, making Evolution GT feel quite modern in that aspect. Whilst the game features a lot of customization of both your driver's look and stats, it does not feature any tuning for the cars themselves, as these are somewhat affected by the driver stats anyway. So let's talk about the presentation. Corvette Evolution GT doesn't exactly wow with its visuals. Even for 2006, textures are a bit basic, lighting is flat, and effects like smoke and tyre marks are minimal. If we compare this to the game that we looked at last week, Ford Street Racing, another 2006 PS2 racer, I would say the car models and the tracks in that game look better visually than they do in this game. That said, the frame rate is nice and stable, and the car models are detailed enough to look convincing for the PS2. Now visually it's not the greatest, but how does it hold up in sound design? Well, it's very middle of the road. The engine audio is functional but lacks the visceral growl of other titles, and the soundtrack is mostly just generic background noise, and that's only on the menus because, ladies and gentlemen, we have another racer that has no music in the race. Why do developers do this? It just makes the game so much more boring than they have to be. I do understand that these are more budget titles, but why does any of that budget never go on music? Oh, it annoys me. Sorry guys, it would seem I'm just a bit passionate about my racing game music. Anyway, other than that, the menus are clean but fairly uninspired, which pretty much means the game in terms of design is just alright, it's fine, it's passable. There's nothing too flashy, it's just stats, cars and tracks, straight to business. So how does the game hold up in terms of its critical response? Well, when it launched, the game received kind of mixed reviews. There are only a couple of reviews for the PS2 version of the game I could find, as it doesn't have any reviews on Metacritic. IGN gave it like a 4 out of 10, but I don't really trust them whatsoever, and it had a 6.9 out of 10 on GameSpot. Most of the praise went into the depth of the RPG-style systems and its realistic car handling, but on the other hand, the criticism came for the bland visuals and just general boringness of the game. I think one of the game's biggest issues, especially in North America, was identity. The Corvette branding made it seem like it was going to be a game purely focused on Corvettes, like the Ford Racing branding, but it wasn't. It was just a rebrand to try and sell more copies of a game definitely not about Corvettes. As well as having little to no review scores, I also wasn't able to find any kind of sales figures for this game whatsoever. So sadly, we will never know how many people actually went out of their way to purchase Corvette Evolution GT, or just Evolution GT, but I don't think it will keep me up at night. When you think about late-era original PlayStation racers, a few giants tend to dominate the conversation. Wipeout XL, Gran Turismo, you know, the icons. But nestled somewhere between anti-gravity racing and, well, real racing, sits one of the strangest, most charmingly misguided combat racers of the late 90s. S.C.A.R.S, which, by the way, stands for Super Computer Animal Racing Simulation. Huh? So, S.C.A.R.S was developed by Vivid Image and was published by Ubisoft, releasing across the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and PC, launching across late 1998 and early 1999 across those 3 different platforms. Anyway, so let's boot up this futuristic game and see what happens when hyper-intelligent supercomputers, well, get bored. S.C.A.R.S opens up with one of those late 90s sci-fi setups that feels equal parts sincere and completely, absolutely ridiculous. In the next millennium, Earth is ruled by colossal supercomputers. Like ChatGPT, I guess. These machines evolve beyond simple logic, they've developed awareness, emotion, and eventually, yeah, they got bored. And what do bored, omnipotent supercomputers do? Well, they create a virtual reality racing league featuring animal-themed combat cars that kind of look like Hot Wheels. Naturally, what else would you do? The supercomputer animal racing simulation becomes their chosen form of entertainment. It's like a holodeck-style battleground, kind of like something you'd expect to see in, like, Star Trek. It's a pretty cool setup, to be honest. I mean, is it absolutely stupid? Yes. But is it memorable? Also yes. In an era when racing games either leaned hard into realism or went full cartoon chaos, S.C.A.R.S has kind of landed somewhere in between. It's self-aware, but it's not quite a parody. So you begin the game with 5 selectable vehicles: Mammoth, Lion, Rhino, Mantis, and Shark. I'm absolutely certain there is a Hot Wheels car that looks identical to that Shark car. Each one represents a classic arcade racing trade-off, like speed versus armor versus grip versus weapon capacity. If you want raw speed, then you'll gravitate toward the Mantis or Shark. They're nimble, fast, and fragile, but they may be harder to control. You'll zip down straightaways, but one well-placed missile, and you're pretty much dead. If you prefer brute force, then the Mammoth or even Rhino are your tanks. They're slower, heavier, but they can absorb punishment and dish it out in return. And then there's the Lion, which is just the middle ground for someone who can't really decide what they want to do. Like me. It's a smart setup, to be honest. Simple, readable options that make it easy to experiment and find your playstyle. Eventually, as you win championships, you can unlock challenges to take on some additional vehicles to unlock for yourself. Scorpion, Cheetah, Cobra, and Panther. And this is kind of where the game's difficulty curve spikes very hard. So the core experience of the game is Grand Prix mode, which is divided into a few main cups, plus a customizable cup that can stretch up to 8 races of your choice. That's a solid amount of content for a late 90s racer. Win a cup and you'll unlock the next one, along with a one-on-one duel against one of the unlockable vehicles which I mentioned just a moment ago. Beat them and the car joins your roster. Simple in theory, but kinda brutal in practice, to be honest. The AI in S.C.A.R.S is aggressive. They are relentless with weapons, they don't seem nearly as affected by terrain as you are, they recover a lot quicker from hits, and in later cups, they can feel almost unfair. There's a distinct sense that the CPU plays by slightly different physics rules. On rough terrain or during tricky drifts, they'll maintain speed in ways that make you question your own understanding of the track and how the game actually works. It's not rubber banding in the Mario Kart sense, but it feels like quiet favoritism from the game. And yet it's kinda compelling. I was restarting races, honestly I was getting pissed off, and was swearing that the AI just ignored patches of mud entirely, but when I did finally win, it does feel earned. But did it have to be that difficult to begin with? I don't know, I guess that's up to you. One of S.C.A.R.'s strongest elements, in my opinion, is the track design. There are 9 primary courses, and they cover a pretty impressive range of environments, from Aztec temples to ski resorts to cities. This variety does a lot of heavy lifting for the replay value. Although personally, the ski resort was an absolutely horrible track, and I tried it with a few different cars and I just couldn't seem to get the drifting around corners right. Because it's all snow, you're just sliding around so much more than you do on other tracks. Anyway, personal gripes aside, the track variety is cool. It's just a shame that the game doesn't utilize this so early on, because in the first cup, there are 3 races, 2 of which for some reason are on the same track. The first one is the Aztec Temple, then you do another track, and then you go back to that Aztec Temple. It's the exact same layout, except it's just a bit darker because it's nighttime. That's the only difference. In my opinion, it kind of leaves a bit of a sour taste in your mouth as a first impression, because it makes the game feel kind of cheap. You know, having 2 of your 3 tracks for your first cup be the same track doesn't really sell the game too well. And first impressions are really everything in the video game world. So let's address it directly. The handling in this game isn't amazing. It's functional, yeah, sure, sometimes it can even feel satisfying, but it's never truly great. Power sliding is essential, especially on rally-style tracks. You'll be feathering the brake and steering into turns constantly, and there is a learning curve to managing grip, especially with the faster, lighter vehicles. And it's a learning curve for those lighter vehicles that I never quite managed to grasp. Heavier cars feel more planted, obviously, but sluggish, and lighter cars feel twitchy. The problem is that the physics don't always feel consistent. Certain terrain types exaggerate awkwardness, sharp turns can sometimes feel like you're fighting the controller, rather than mastering it. And there's also parts of the environment that you do sometimes just clip on, even when you feel like you shouldn't. That said, for the most part, once you adjust expectations and learn the car's quirks, it can kind of click. Not in a silky precision way, sure, but in a scrappy arcade survival kind of way. And in a combat racer, I guess that's enough. It's not the best, but it's certainly not the worst we've seen in this series. Now, as I mentioned, this is a combat racer, so of course there's going to be weapons and power-ups, and they are scattered across the tracks as glowing icon-based pickups. You've got your obvious staples like missiles, shields, boosts, but S.C.A.R.S also introduces some relatively creative ideas. Magnet traps that freeze you or your opponents in place, energy barriers you must jump over, and the infamous skull bomb, which is counting down from the minute you pick it up, and you can pass it onto an opponent, but they can also pass it back to you right before it explodes, so you don't have time to pass it on. So the best thing to do is just let the countdown go to like 1 and immediately press the item button to pass it on, and then there's no chance of you getting blown up. And to be fair, those moments are chaotic and can be quite funny. You'll see the bomb icon switch cars multiple times in the final seconds before detonation. It's one of those mechanics that kind of feels ahead of its time in terms of party game design. It encourages proximity and risk, and it's kind of like a mind game sometimes. For a relatively niche 1998 original PlayStation title, I would say that S.C.A.R.S actually looks quite impressive. The textures are varied, the lighting effects, especially the headlights during night races, are pretty good. Rain and environmental effects add some atmosphere. But the real standout is how the game handles draw distance and pop-in. Because the entire racing league is set inside a virtual reality simulation, whenever the hardware struggles to render distant geometry, the world briefly displays a blue wireframe grid. It's framed as the simulation building the environment in real time, and honestly that's such a genius workaround. Instead of immersion breaking pop-in, you get a lore-consistent visual effect. It rarely appears on the actual racing surface, so it doesn't really disrupt gameplay, but it's a smart creative workaround to technical limitations, which is something I don't think has been spoken about enough for this game. As well as being pretty impressively visually designed, the sound design is actually also quite good. The soundtrack is good. Each track has its own distinct theme that matches the vibe it's going for, like the Aztec Temple. It's all decent, it's just not groundbreaking, but it certainly fits the aesthetic of each track, so that's a win in my books. It's not as iconic as some other licensed soundtracks in racing games, but it complements the races well and keeps momentum up. Sound effects are punchy, the explosions have weight, weapon activations are distinct enough to signal danger. The engine noises are less memorable, but they still work, so overall, it's a solid audio package. S.C.A.R.S is just a weird game because it never became a flagship franchise, it didn't even redefine combat racing or dethrone the giants. But it represents something really interesting about the late PlayStation era. Studios were experimenting, blending genres, trying weird and wild concepts. Like Ubisoft, long before massive open worlds like Assassin's Creed, were willing to greenlight a combat racer about sentient supercomputers staging animal-themed virtual reality tournaments. That kind of risk feels rarer now, and while it's not a masterpiece, I'd say this game is definitely memorable and has personality. So in terms of critical response, the game did not have enough reviews on Metacritic to get a Metascore, but on the now defunct website Game Rankings, the original PlayStation version held a 67% out of 100, which makes sense in my eyes. Unfortunately, this game would not sell very well, having sold approximately 80,000 units across its lifespan, and those figures are from VG charts. Because stupid premise or not, S.C.A.R.S actually has a lot going for it. A creative theme, varied track design, some clever technical tricks, and a good soundtrack. It's not incredibly deep, and the handling isn't great, and the AI can be sickening, but there's still some fun to be had here. It kind of occupies that strange middle ground, too weird to be mainstream but too competent to be forgotten. And in the crowded garage of PlayStation racers, sometimes that's enough to earn it a second look. And if nothing else, it answers one very important question. When ChatGPT finally gets bored, we now know that instead of turning into Skynet from Terminator, it's just gonna create S.C.A.R.S, so that's alright. And so that takes us to the end of our look at S.C.A.R.S, and with it this week's episode of Worst Racing Games. So let me know in the comments down below, what do you think of this game? Would you rank it any differently? And as always, if you have any suggestions to add to the wheel of suggestions, well, let me know as well. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe and tap that bell for notifications. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thank you, and bye bye.
Accelerating. Full gravity. Too slow.